Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Day in the Life Career Insights brought to you by ConsultSpot. This one's going to be the last one for the year. So, over the course of the last 3.5 months since we've started this podcast, I think we've put about 10 episodes out, and so far the response has been great. So, I think the goal going forward for the next year is to roughly stay at about an episode a week pace. And as usual, if you have any feedback on the format of these episodes, any questions you'd like to ask the people I have on here, feel free to send me a note. It's hello@consultspot.com. And if you've been listening to this podcast, you probably know there's a platform on the back end that we're trying to build out that gives people the option to find people who are in careers that you're interested in and either book a one-on-one call or subscribe to their mentorship program as well. So a big focus, and we'll have a few announcements coming relatively soon. We'll be pushing the platform out more, and I'm excited about what's to come. I think a lot of people will find some value in the services that we'll be offering through the platform, and I'm excited for 2023. We got a lot of good things in the pipeline. So thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing if you have. If not, this is a plug to try and share to friends. But uh, aside from that, let's jump into today's podcast. So today I have a friend of mine. Her name is Michaela Dunn. Michaela is a judicial law clerk, and we dove a lot into the process of getting into law school, what to expect, the lifestyle, how to make the most out of it, and also coming out of law school, what are your options in terms of the different career paths, judicial law clerk being one of them. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Hey, Michaela, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Yadis, thanks for having me.
Great. Just to get us started, do you mind giving us an overview of what you do?
Absolutely. I currently serve as a judicial law clerk, which is just another way of saying that I'm an attorney that works for a judge. In this case, I work for three different judges across two
Hmm.
counties. And law clerks work on research and judicial drafting and prepping for hearings.
Cool, that's helpful. Let's take a step back. Could you give us some context into your educational background and any relevant work experience that you've had leading up to this?
Sure. Went to undergrad at UMass Amherst. I
Hmm.
studied politics, political science, and legal studies. I focused on public policy, and a lot of my internships in that format were based on legislative research and constituent services. I found that working for elected officials, there was a lot of bumps in the road in terms of you'd have constituents coming in with problems with different government agencies or maybe particular zoning issues, town ordinances, and things like that. And more often than not, the advice that you would give was for them to hire a private attorney.
Hmm.
So I ended up looking into law school. I had a great networking system and background in UMass, so I had quite a few alums who had gone the law school path. Ended up going to Suffolk Law in Boston, and through that, I did some various public sector internships. And at one point, I did an externship with an appeals court judge and worked for him during the semester. And I really enjoyed being on the judicial side of things.
Hmm.
And it's often a really good first step for young attorneys, particularly attorneys who go straight through from undergrad to law school and don't
Hmm.
necessarily have that much work experience, to do a clerkship, which is set up to be a temporary position.
Got it. Could you take us through the process of law school? How'd you go about, selecting your schools? What exams do you have to take? And kind of what's important when applying to kind of give yourselves the best shot?
Right. For exams, I took the LSAT and the GRE. I did not end up using my GRE school scores just because at the time most of the schools only took LSAT, but I think there's
Hmm.
been a wave to take either both or some in some cases just your GRE scores. The LSAT itself is a beast, and I did take a prep course. So I recommend
Hmm.
people look into that. It depends on your learning style, though. Don't just take a course because people say that you should. If you are an independent learner, absolutely buy the materials, but there's no reason you
Hmm.
can't study on your own if you know that that's how you're most successful. And then I did the regular gambit with graduate programs, and I applied to quite a few, tried to see which offers came in. I had a particular interest in ending up in the public sector
Hmm.
once I passed the bar. So when I was making choices, I was looking for the most financially savvy choice. And Suffolk Law has a really gave me a full ride scholarship, and that was kind of a no brainer at that point.
Hmm.
So I chose Suffolk.
Okay, and the bar is the exam you take before in order to get into law school, if I'm
You
not
take
mistaken.
the LSAT before law school as a part of your application, and then once you've graduated from law school, the law
Then
school
you take the bar.
essentially yeah, they essentially sponsor you to take the bar to be admitted in this particular state.
Got it. And when did you start prepping for your LSAT? Because I know you said you went directly from undergrad, and I guess a follow-up question is it more common for people to take a break in between undergrad and law school, or is it kind of, a mix of both?
It's much more common for people to take a break. I shouldn't say break, but they work, and,
Yep.
they often take that opportunity to narrow in on what practice area they wanna be on in. So they
Mm-hmm.
will be a paralegal, legal assistant, um, they could be like a law clerk, receptionist, whatever they choose to be prior to law school for a
Mm-hmm.
firm. And then from there, for myself, for going straight from undergrad, it was the summer in between my junior and senior year. I had to have been registered for the LSAT prep course, and I took
Mm-hmm.
the test in the fall of my senior year.
Got it. And law school is 3 years, correct?
Yep.
And it's similar, like, you have 2 semesters a year, or is it kind of different where you have like a longer stretch, or is it similar with like 3 months off in the summer?
Yeah, same format as the typical undergrad year, it's just in 3 years. There are a lot of programs that end up doing, dual degrees with a JD MBA or a JD and a public admin degree, so those would be a 4-year program, but typically just
Hmm.
the regular basic it shouldn't be basic isn't the word, but the Juris Doctorate is a 3-year degree.
Okay. I guess this is a very simple question, but what is law school like? What should people expect out of law school? Like, is it very class heavy, or is it kind of you're more on your own and you're kind of like, I picture a kid digging through his textbooks all day long, but so what's it like?
It's a lot of intensive independent work. There is
Hmm.
a massive reading load, and the way that they orient class is almost a reverse learning style. You're not just doing textbook reading, but you're prepping notes and questions and discussion prior to entering class.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, there's a cold call format, so you have no idea if you're going to be called on to discuss the topic. And the first year typically is every general area. So you do
Hmm.
property law, criminal law, constitutional law, civil procedure, and you cover those basic courses that will be on the bar for the most part. You usually take a writing course. And then as you get into your second and third year, you start to take more heavy courses like evidence, trial advocacy, and you can start to narrow in on practice area as well.
And how many classes a semester are you usually taking? And also, from a lifestyle perspective, like what can people expect if you sign up for it? Like, is it very intense and you're kind of putting 60, 80 hours a week towards it, or is it a little bit more manageable?
Yeah, in terms of lifestyle, it is a full-time job plus overtime.
Hmm.
And I think there are great evening course opportunities. So if someone is working for the day, you can take your JD as an evening program, depending on what school you apply to. But if you're doing the day program for 3 years, it's typically not recommended that you work during your first year,
Hmm.
which is really tough for a lot of people, understandably so. So if you're planning to go to law school, you should try to plan financially to be able to take that full first year, and not be working.
Mhm.
And then once you head into your second and third year, I know in Suffolk in particular, they orient it so the upper class students can take evening classes. So a lot of
Mhm.
people will do maybe an intern or externship, or they will work during the day, take classes at night. But it is a full load. I loved law school and I love my field, but I just hesitate to say that to be too strong in saying that it sucks up most of your time and there's
Yeah.
not much time for anything else. It's a full commitment, and that's just the nature of the beast.
Mhm.
And I would sort of along those same lines, financially planning once you finish graduating. Most people graduate in May and then
Mhm.
end up taking the July bar exam. And once you graduate in May, typically people will take a week to 2 weeks of a break. And then it is every day, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week, studying for the bar. So they also tell you not to have a job for the whole summer prior to the bar exam.
Hmm.
There are often, if you're worried about that, there are often firms that will sponsor people. So you know that you have a job. They're obviously not going
Mhm.
to be paying you while you're studying, but you at
Yep.
least can get hired prior to passing the bar and you have that in the bag. But otherwise, your job is to study.
Jesus. Definitely doesn't
Yeah.
sound like something for me, but I guess if you're passionate about it. Uh, Also, I know this is probably a very broad question, but like in the mid range, like how much can people expect to spend on law school? Like I said, I know it drastically differs based on kind of scholarship and the program you get into, but how much would you say like the average person should expect?
From my recollection, tuition per year can be anywhere from high 40s to low $70,000 a year. So you can
Okay.
expect to pay for that for 3 years, and then obviously you don't have housing, so you need to anticipate having to save money for your rent and living expenses.
Okay, and that obviously varies based on where you're based as well. That's helpful.
Yep.
Uh, I guess last question on law school. Uh, in terms of you always hear about like if you're in college, like by junior year you have to land an internship, especially if you want to go into tech and things like that. Like, what's the expectation, or is there one throughout law school in terms of getting summer internships and things like that? Is it something you kind of have to do, or is it dependent on the person, or what's optimal?
I would say that once you're enrolled in law school, it is expected to be entering internships each summer.
Okay.
Prior to law school, I think there's a lot of concern with the types of majors that people end up taking in undergrad prior to law school are political science, they're legal studies, sometimes it's art history, history, etc. And a lot of times internships or jobs related to that in undergrad are unpaid. So I'll
Mm-hmm.
caveat that when people are looking to through your applications to get into law school, they actually really respect people who just have a regular job in the summer or
Mm-hmm.
during college. They're not necessarily looking at your internship experience at the college level, but once you hit law school, it's really important that you start to navigate what field and practice area you want to be in. And you hit that first summer running, you get into a program. Sometimes you continue during the semester, and then typically people end up choosing a second year summer internship or program that gets them a job after job offer post graduation.
Okay. You touched on something there with undergrad. Does it matter what major you picked in undergrad at all for law school, or is it kind of like you're covering totally different things, so it doesn't really matter? Or I guess are there majors that help your application to get in?
I think that would depend on at large. I'll restart. At large, I don't think it matters what major
Hmm.
you have in your undergraduate program. What I will say, if you are someone who is the foresight that you know you're going to be, for example, in patent law, a lot of
Hmm.
those people have science and engineering degrees in their undergraduate
Hmm.
background. So there's a wide range of backgrounds from people. There are actually a lot of police officers in law school, which I think was really
Hmm.
fascinating. A lot of people who are, at least at Suffolk, where you have an evening program, a lot of people who are on their second career and
Hmm.
navigating that way. A lot of people who were in the banking industry and now want to work in business equities and things like that. So
Got it. If you had to give someone one piece of advice in terms of uh, giving themselves the best shot at law school, what would that be? What should they focus on? Like, how would you say they can improve their odds?
I would say that you should first find your why. And I know that's a little general philosophical answer, but what I mean by that is when you're applying to law school, the second you walk in for orientation in law school, despite the fact that you consider yourself a student, that's day one of your career
Hmm.
because you're working, your deans, your professors, they're all attorneys. You're in a
Hmm.
network, it's a very small field. So when you are presenting yourself for an admissions department, if you can make yourself a more well-rounded individual, I think GPA is extremely important. Obviously, LSAT is given a heavy weight when you're doing admissions, but depending on your background in activism or your job background, your education background, having a more well-rounded individual is something that they heavily look for in law school because you're entering a field where you're representing a community, you're representing individuals, so on and so forth. So it doesn't necessarily have to only be on your GPA. And I would just say to plan ahead,
I'm assuming
unfortunately.
that, yeah, and I'm assuming that you have to submit an essay as well, right? So you kind of have to
Yes.
translate that into your essay, which probably helps your odds as well.
Yep. Yep. I had a really strong personal statement, I will say. And when the best advice I got for the application itself was when you're working on an essay, find somebody who knows you really well,
Hmm.
might not know anything about the industry. Find someone who knows the industry really well or law school really well. And then find someone
Hmm.
who knows you really well from a work or education background. So typically, what that looks like is you have a career advisor or a graduate advisor from your undergraduate program. You have a professor, you have a former boss who's reading your work, and then you're having someone from your personal life. So that way, you're having someone from every asset of you reading your
Hmm.
personal statement and making sure that it conveys the things about yourself that you want that person to know.
Got it. That's super helpful. Let's switch gears into the professional side. I know early on you mentioned that pretty early on, you knew that you wanted to go into the public sector. I'm curious what kind of drove you to the public sector, and at a high level, can you touch on the different paths that people have out of law school, like corporate law or kind of starting your practice? Just I know there's probably a lot, but if you can just lay out a few different options, both in the public and private sector, that'd be helpful to a lot of people to know, I think.
Absolutely. So for myself, like I said, in undergraduate, had a politics, constituent services, and policy background. So I thought that I was going to continue with that. I entered law school. Did a lot of government agency internships. I interned for a district attorney's office, for the attorney general's office. I ended up serving as what they call a baby attorney or a student prosecutor in my final year. So I
Hmm.
had my own cases and I was representing the Commonwealth in the court, prosecuting drug offenses, firearm offenses, that sort of thing. And then I ended up, like I said, interning for a judge, and I really enjoyed that perspective of the litigation experience. And so I transferred that to my clerkship. So technically, I am, a public sector employee. I work for the government. I work for the state of New Hampshire in a
Hmm.
county. And moving forward, I think I'm heavily interested in complex commercial and civil litigation. So I'm
Hmm.
actually, I would say, rerouting my career interest, moving from the public sector to a private firm in the future.
Hmm.
Once you graduate from law school, you can really go down a few different avenues, but on a broad perspective, you can be a litigator. So you're in the courtroom. You can
Hmm.
be a litigator in the public sector, you might be a prosecutor, a public defender, or you might be a private criminal defense attorney. You could also be litigating in the public sector for a government agency. So you could have a town you're litigating, representing, or against the town, or you could be litigating for or against a public agency, like you see the EPA and the Department of Health
Hmm.
and Human Services in lawsuits. In the private sector, you can still be a litigator, you're representing individuals or companies, or you can be in transactional law. And transactional law is contracts. And the in that avenue, you can also be in-house counsel. And in-house counsel,
Hmm.
you work directly for that company. The company is your client. You can also work in human resources and compliance work. And lastly, well, not lastly, there's a few others, but in terms of a large sector, people work for the government directly as a policy advisor, or maybe you're working
Hmm.
for a legislature or senate helping draft laws.
I know this might be a very silly question, but I know at least one person will have it. What does it mean to be a litigator or to litigate?
Right. To be a litigator or to litigate a case means that you are in front of a judge arguing against opposing counsel. You are arguing against an actual lawsuit. So you have a specific grievance and a specific claim, whether or not it's a common law claim or a statute, meaning you have a tort statute in your state. So if you have a slip and fall, it's a very specific claim for those injuries. So you're
Hmm.
litigating that specific grievance versus transactional law. We're never in a courtroom because you and I are, I won't want to say arguing, but that was the first word I was going to go for. But if you're arguing transactional law, you and I are going back and forth negotiating a contract or
Hmm.
going over different deals. You and I are going over, we have human resource backgrounds and we're going over this complaint that was made to HR and
Hmm.
making sure that we are complying with federal regulations and laws and that sort of thing.
Got it. And when you touched on corporate law, does patent law fall within corporate, law as well, or is that kind of a space on its? I know it's something that seems to be gaining more popularity these days, or at least
Yeah,
seems like it.
it's not my area of expertise, but in terms of when you're in the beginning of your career and you're looking where things are categorized, I would say patent law is towards corporate law because you're often working for a tech company and you're in the legal department, but you're working on the transactional aspect of actually applying for patents and protecting
Hmm.
those claims where the intent is to avoid being in the courtroom at all costs.
Got it. That makes sense. I guess focusing on your role specifically, you said you're a judicial clerk, correct?
Yep,
Could you take us through what a typical day in your life is like?
sure. For a judicial law clerk, I think first it's important to know you can be a law clerk in a private firm, which is a different role, and you're often not a licensed attorney in that position. You can also be a clerk of court, and your clerk of court in your courthouse is working with directly with the public and parties as they file things. That person is a licensed attorney. And then you have what's called a judicial law clerk, which is what I am. So I'm kind of working more in the background and I work directly for the judge. So on an average day, I enter the courthouse, I go and I check what the docket is. I see if there's any new pleadings or filings. I may attend hearings. I may work on prepping the judge for hearings. But in general, we have any number of cases pending at a time, and I am working through whatever motions or disputes are active at that moment. So in a criminal case, you have motions to suppress evidence, you have motions to dismiss, you have evidentiary hearings and things like that. And I am attending those hearings, prepping for those hearings, reading through the pleadings, researching the law, and consulting and drafting something for the judge to work through and eventually issue as a final order.
Got it. And in terms of lifestyle, how many hours are you working every week? Do you have to? Is it something that you have to be at the office 5 days a week for, in terms of not just with your specific role, but maybe at like other counties as well. Like,
Mhm.
could you give us a sense of what people can expect on the day to day?
Yeah. I think in a post-COVID world, there is a lot more opportunity for remote hearings. For a law clerk position, you're most often going to have to be in the courthouse, however, because you need to be in the law library and have access
Mm-hmm.
to all the books. Most of those things are available in online legal research databases, but I think, at least for our county and for the other counties in the state of New Hampshire, everyone is expected to be in office as much as possible. I
Mm-hmm.
think for the work-life balance in terms of hours a week, a law clerk position is ideal coming out of law school because you hear the typical attorney sort of working excess hours, never home, etc. And very
Mm-hmm.
often that happens, especially if you're in trial practice. And I think in law school, you feel that way as well. So if you enter a law clerk position, you work the hours of the court, which is a great benefit to me. I'm typically home very early. I get in around 8 o'clock. Courthouse opens at 9. Courthouse closes at 4. I'm out the door by 4:30.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that's an ideal hour schedule. There are times where you stay after for depending on the courthouse schedule. But for work-life balance and transitioning out of law school, law clerk is a very digestible hourly workload.
And what is your next step, I guess, in terms of your progression? I know you hinted at it a little earlier, but
Mhm.
uh, and it might be a little too early to tell. But I'm curious where you're thinking your next step will be, or how long do people usually spend in the law clerk position, or is it something that some people spend their whole career in, or is it
That's a
mostly
great
seen as like
question.
a transitionary role?
That's a great question. I would say the average law clerk is a temporary position, and it's typically for a 1-year term. Mine in
Mm-hmm.
particular is for a 2-year term. I'm at a trial court level, so you can be in an appellate level of trial court. I think starting in a trial court and moving on to an appellate court is a very common option for law clerks. I'm considering going to a federal trial court position, but otherwise, my priority is to move into a civil litigation firm and work on complex litigation and complex commercial issues. I think there is a little known fact that there are some lifers, as we call them, and it's a permanent
Mm-hmm.
law clerk, and we have people who have been there for decades and who are fantastic at their job. There are also a lot of law clerks who move on to be staff attorney positions, which is a similar role in that you are reviewing final orders after they've been drafted and finalized and checking for various legal citations and really nitpicking on certain issues that have to when you have a final order, especially if you're in a state supreme court. You might have law
Mm-hmm.
clerks working with the judges prior to and helping draft a final order. That order is finalized. It gets to the staff attorneys who work for the court, and they are reviewing to make sure that the legal precedent cited to is correct and that it's cited to correctly because an appellate decision, a Supreme Court decision ends up being legal precedent for somebody else. So if someone's going to be using that case and say that this is law, that is double checked multiple times.
Got it. The next question is a little bit tricky because I know it with law, like compensation and things like that, vary a lot. But if you
Mhm,
were to provide a range, both for like the judicial clerk position and just in terms of how much people can expect to make being in different practices, what
mhm.
would you say people can expect to make? I know, like, once again, it varies drastically.
Yeah, it definitely varies. I'll caveat that I am basing my knowledge on the Northeast as well, so obviously cost of living in different areas changes.
Mm-hmm.
The law clerk position, we have wonderful benefits. You're working for the state and you get great hours. Do not expect particularly wonderful pay. That's
Mm-hmm.
something that people typically, that's well known in the legal circles is if you're a law clerk, it can be tough. For a state law, so I'm a state trial court position right now. The average range is probably between 60 and $70,000. If you're working for a state appellate court or a state supreme court, you're looking more between 70 and $80,000. If you move on to a federal court, the range is much wider depending on how many prior years experience you have. That can be 70 to
Mhm.
100K. Once you get into private practice, if you're in big law and you're a junior associate just coming in, your base salary is $190,000. So there's quite a big gap in that versus if you are in the state prosecutor or public defender role, you're looking 70K and below. And then smaller firms, mid-sized firms, or private practices are in between those two ranges. And those can vary drastically depending on practice area and the size of the firm, meaning how many resources they have.
And obviously, if you run an independent practice, then it's completely based on, I guess, is it billed hourly typically? Is that what
Typically.
independent lawyers? Okay.
And that
And
will also depend on your practice area. A lot of people will bill hourly in transactional and commercial litigation, but there are people who do personal injury law, excuse me, those who practice personal injury law, the
Mhm.
bill is based on a contingency fee system. So you will estimate that you're going to bring in a certain award of damages, and your attorney
Mhm.
will take a percentage of that to pay them for their work throughout the trial.
That's an interesting point. Is that the only context where an attorney takes a certain percentage of the? I don't want to call it a commission because it's not really a commission, I guess. But
Sure.
is that the only context where something like that happens, or is there other areas where part of the, let's call it winnings, go to the lawyer, or are they just paid off of kind of their hourly rate?
The attorney will only get a portion of your eventual damages award if it is based on a contingency fee payment agreement to begin with. If the attorney is being
Hmm.
paid prior to that, they don't get a portion of your earnings.
Okay, got it. Uh, Last question. If you were to give one piece of advice to someone, in college or in a different career, thinking of switching over, and they're potentially looking to be in a position similar to yourself, what would that be?
Great question. I think, particularly in the legal field, you have to be prepared for learning entirely new style of learning and
Hmm.
an entirely new language. It most definitely changes the way you problem solve and think on a daily basis. So, to say that as a context, my biggest piece of advice would be to learn how to get comfortable with saying, I don't know, and learn how to get comfortable with making a mistake. And the best way to do that is to be in a position where you have a strong sense of self. So you
Hmm.
can, when you're in a law school perspective, it's everything is graded on a curve. And there's very often where you don't get a grade until the very end of the semester on your final exam. That might be the only grade you have, which for some people that's not new because that's how certain undergraduate fields are. But for most people in law school, that's a new concept because you're doing papers, et cetera, in undergrad. So have a true sense of self. Understand where you are in the pack. Are people asking questions that you're also asking? Do you already know the
Hmm.
answers to the questions they're asking in class? Or are you shocked that they're thinking that far ahead? So understand your sense of self and be comfortable with accepting what you don't know so that you can target a plan and develop yourself from that base point.
That's super helpful. Well, Michaela, this has been very informative. I feel like we covered a lot of different aspects of law school. I appreciate you taking the time and sharing some very helpful knowledge with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to do it.
All right. Talk soon. Bye.
Bye.
All right. That's a wrap. Once again, thanks so much for listening. And if you're not following us on social media, please do. It's Consult Spot or Consult Spot app on all platforms. We post clips on TikTok and Instagram as of now, but we plan to post it on other platforms as well. Some people like the short form content as well. And as usual, if you'd like to speak to any of the people that we have on the platform or on the podcast, feel free to send us an email at hello@consultspod.com, and we'll put you in touch with them for a one-on-one call. That's pretty much it. Happy New Year, everyone. See you next year. Bye.